Hi friends, the book that I want to really talk about today is a book called 1599 One Year in the Life of Shakespeare. Now, how could I have talked about books and not touched on the master playwright, right? It had to be. He goes without saying into any list on books and literature. But I want to start off by why I chose this book. Now, my tryst with Shakespeare again began somewhere in my college time and all. India today, at that time, as I recall, had a scheme going on that if you buy a certain, I don't know, number of years of subscription, they gave you this very neat, thick book, okay, this thick or something, with leather cover and your initials on it, and it was like very well done entire works of Shakespeare, everything. And I got it, and I was very happy, and I really hadn't read Shakespeare, and that's when I started reading it. I mean, Hamlet, Othello, As You Like It, the whole Henry series. I mean, you can just go on and on. Julius Caesar. I really don't know how you define which is the best Shakespearean play. And I also don't know how do you define his influence, you know, on literature or on movies. I mean, the movies that are inspired by him are not just the movies which are direct tributes like the whole Vishal Bhardwaj series of, Makbul and Omkara and all of these movies. They are also those that derive so many of their characters from him. The whole, tragedy of Hamlet or of the murder of Caesar, the way Shakespeare has put it forward, the way words and phrases that he created later became part of the English language, they all are tributes to him. Shakespeare looms like a legend. You don't say whether Shakespeare was good. You argue in college canteens and later on in life as to whether Othello was better or Macbeth was better. Whether you liked his comedy or you liked his tragedy. Whether you found the whole speech of Caesar better or you thought Hamlet's to be or not to be was better. My own personal memory, I mean, tells me when you read the whole speech of Hamlet, and that's just one line that has become so immortal, to be or not to be. But if you read the entire huge paragraph that he speaks, I thought he captured so many essences of life. You know, you could probably say he captured the entire essence of life as man understands it. It was so beautifully done. So, definitely, I thought most of his tragedies were more powerful than the likes of As You Like It. But then to each his own. But then you would wonder, why did I not name one of these plays and say this is the play that I want to talk to you about, but rather I talk about this book, and I don't talk about him in the literary section, but I talk about Shakespeare in the biography section. This book is called 1599 One Year in the Life of William Shakespeare. It's a highly acclaimed book, and of course, huge volumes by many authors have been written on Shakespeare in all manners. You know, there are books that you would have read probably which dispute whether the real Shakespeare was somebody else, etc., etc. There were rumors that Francis Bacon was the one who was actually Shakespeare, but he was, from a noble birth and all, so he didn't want to be seen as a writer of plays. That was considered very low at that time. There are all sorts of rumors, all sorts of books which talk about all these issues, and there are people who books that analyzes writings. But this book really reinvented Shakespeare for me. And I'll tell you why. This book captures one year in the life of Shakespeare. This 1599 year is a very significant year in Shakespeare's life and in English history. On a macro level, 1599 is the year where Elizabeth is ruling and the Spanish Armada attacks and they are able to save themselves. That is the single biggest event which marks the beginning of the fall of the then superpower, which is Spain, and the rise of England. It is the year when Queen Elizabeth sends her troops into Ireland, and that to many is the beginning of English imperialism. 1599 is also the year where Queen Elizabeth signs the charter of that famous company, the British East India Company. So it is the year where England is stepping into becoming a global power. As it became a global power, England also emerged out of the shadows of the court French and started being proud of its own native language called English. Shakespeare was right there when history was being made. On Shakespeare's personal front, he was going to use this year to become from a good writer to the greatest. Plays like Henry V, Julius Caesar, As You Like It, and Hamlet all came in this year, and they catapulted him to being the best. But there is something much more profound that this book talks about, and that is, it completely shakes your image of Shakespeare. How do you see Shakespeare? You imagine, this great writer sitting in some big castle and very highly respected by all the nobles and maybe the queen herself, and he just has time for his intellectual pursuits. Cut to the chase. This book brings you down to reality. The man has to act. Sometimes when the actor is not there, he has to do his post production work. He and his partners have to struggle day in and day out to survive. Even when they have written, they are one of the best. Theatre was not that kind of paying avenue that we understand it today. There are disputes where the land where they were doing some theatre is, they have not paid the fees, or there's some controversy, so they go in the middle of the night and they cut off the logs. They need the set so desperately. They don't have logs, they don't have the props, that they go in the middle of a wintry night. And can you imagine Shakespeare carrying logs and props on his shoulders and running away? Threat of being arrested. It was survival. Many a times they did not have the right kind of fees to give to top artists, so Shakespeare had to sometimes do bit roles in his own plays. It immediately makes you realize that Shakespeare in his mind did not think of himself as Shakespeare. You understand? He's not like this great director that we today imagine, writing plays, and people are desperate to act in his plays. Despite he and his company doing well in terms of some of these plays, he had to, with every play, ensure commercial success, because that was survival. In those times, many people used to say that, well, he's good, but he's a very massy writer. He had to insert comedy and make sure that there is enough comedy, because the audience will not come and see it. He had to at the same time write a play which could be presented in the Queen's Court, but that would not just get him this bread and butter, because they had to keep playing it again and again, and that cannot be done on the court. So they had to do it to the common people, and the common people only wanted slapstick comedy. It is a very important part. So therefore, today, what we think as genius mix of comedy and tragedy was the need of the hour. Shakespeare was not trying to create masterpieces. Shakespeare was trying to earn a decent living. His wife and his daughters used to live in one part of England, and he could only afford normally an annual trip to his family through very poor highways in those times. And that finds mention in many of his plays, with back-breaking journeys across the countryside. And it was not through some sort of a, what you can call, horse wagon or something. Often he was hiking, you know and going from one small carriage, or or going with some other friend who was going somehow along with them. He did not have the luxury of being like this aristocrat. Nowhere was Shakespeare anywhere close in monetary terms to be treated as a nobility or aristocrat. When you see Shakespeare, sharing rides, when you see Shakespeare barely able to meet his family, when you see Shakespeare carrying props and logs and struggling with day to day physical labor, when you see him struggling to get top actors, he and his partners, to work in his plays, when you see him many a times mocked as, what do you call, a massy playwright, and also when you see him constantly trying to think of whether the poorest man on the street will find this commercially viable, humorous or not. When you see top actors of those times who were basically comics, who would do stints in between acts, which are not now preserved in the written plays. In the actual rendition, what would happen is, between two scenes, a comic actor would come around and doing all sorts of clowny activity, just like in a circus, in between the play. It is very hard to imagine if things were like that were done in between Hamlet and or Julius Caesar, a clown coming in, and because to expect the audience to completely be engrossed in a tragedy was not viable. He had to make sure that it was humorous. When you think of all of those things, you realize that what we have built an image of Shakespeare was not Shakespeare necessarily. It makes me realize that what we think in terms of posterity maybe doesn't even matter to the man who is now long gone. We have built him up as this great legend. We have built him up as a genius, and I'm very sure if you or ask anybody on the street as how does he picture Shakespeare in his later years as this successful playwright, any of you them would imagine him as how the nobility would be living like, right? This great master. I mean, we would simply juxtapose our world onto him. That is the way you see top Bollywood directors or Hollywood directors living in huge mansions with people running around and just saying, look, you just concentrate on the creative part of it, and they thinking, and the moment they have an idea, having a couple of writers to write for them, and we imagine that's how Shakespeare must have done. So I can you imagine Raju Hirani carrying props on his back? I mean, I'm not talking about his struggling days, I'm talking about today. Can you imagine Sanjay Leela Bhansali trying to escape and get some hardware out of some studio? I'm not in any way trying to mock the directors in question. I'm trying to talk about legends of our times. And then when I look back at the legend of that time, I realize that that man must have had a very struggling existence. When I realize that, it gives me a different flavor of Shakespeare. And in the end, it makes me respect the work that he did even more. It was great when it was written by somebody in a huge room with some in a velvety chair. It becomes out of this world extraordinary when it was written by a man who did not know whether his company will survive the next month or not. whether his partners will continue to support him, whether he will have to do the role himself or get a decent actor to do it. Thank you.